something quite good. And Lucas as well said, yes, fine, I'll back your project. Now Mays's proposition was, we want two things from you. We want money and we want help in kind. We want you and your colleagues, your other colleagues in the motor industry to make things for us. And we'll be happy to have you support us in that way, roughly half and half. Cash and kind. That was the proposition that he put to these industry leaders. And they gradually started to come on board, and they established a trust, a British motor racing trust, to support the effort. Now, the actual physical operations were set up in the maltings next to the Mays residence in Bourne in Lincolnshire. Not exactly the heart of the British motor industry. And this is the machine shop. Now, it's not a very impressive machine shop because, as I say, their idea was that the work would be done by people in the motor industry. And they needed, to have their own capability. And this was the machine shop. And this was the erection shop upstairs, where engines, gearboxes, components of the cars were assembled, and then they open a port in the floor and lower the parts through to the assembly shop down below. And the engineering offices were the upper levels of the maltings in Bourne. It looks at a glance fairly capable, but in the winter, the draftsmen had to wear aircraftsman's gloves to manage to continue to work in the cold conditions of the upper levels of the malting, so that they were not exactly set up in the ideal conditions. So what were these chaps going to do? The technical brains trust behind the BRM included Harry Mundy on the left, who was, of course, one of the architects of the Jaguar six-cylinder engine. Leaning over him was Eric Richter, who took on the main task of the sort of detail engineering of the engine of the BRM. Peter Berthen, Mays' technical colleague, led the technical effort. Mays next, and then on the right, Frank May, who was one of the other engineers. Now, they had, of course, to decide from scratch what to do. And having set out their stall, as they did, saying, we're going to build a world beater, they couldn't just build a kind of ordinary racing car. Maserati had four-cylinder engines and some sixes. The ERA had been a 1.5-liter six. The formula they were building for was the new formula for 1.5-liter supercharged cars, the new Formula One. 8-cylinder engines. Mercedes had one that they raced before the war. Alfa had an 8-cylinder that was very successful. Ferrari was just coming in, just starting to build his first 12-cylinder engines. So they decided to build a 16-cylinder engine for the 1.5-liter Grand Prix Formula. And they conceived an engine with basically two 750cc V8s back-to-back with gear trains between them, and cam drives gears up the center of the engine and then drives down to a half-speed shaft at the bottom of the engine to carry the power forward to the superchargers and back to the clutch. A unique achievement and a very, very daring approach. And the concept was, and the people involved in the project at the time said, look, we had no option. We had to choose a very, very ambitious engine to support the concept that we had put forward to the motor industry, which was we're going to build a world beater. This is me holding a piston and connecting rod of the BRM, just to give an idea of the scale of these parts. Quite small, could almost be a watch fob, really. The crankshaft was made by English steel. The gears at the center drove both the cam camshafts up above and the subshaft down below. So English steel made and machined and produced the crankshafts for them. The complete engine assembly, lacking cylinder heads here, gives an idea of the ambition and complexity of this amazing engine. The huge sort of pump in the foreground is just a water pump. It's not a supercharger. You might think it was. The main engine components and the sump, the under part of the engine were all machined by Standard Motors. Standard Motors took on the job of making all these parts from castings supplied by other firms that provided the castings as part of the Mays project that was initially known. David Brown made the gears, and they were very proud to point out the different gears they made for all elements of the engine, the gearbox, and so forth. Extremely detailed parts, and David Brown were one of a total of 350 companies that eventually could say, yes, we supported the BRM project. That was the number of British firms that eventually stepped up to the plate to say, yes, we will provide help in cash and in kind to the trust, to BRM. The coup, if there was a coup in this whole project, it was the fact that they managed to inveigle Rolls-Royce into designing and conceiving and making the superchargers for this car. We are talking about, as I say, a supercharged 1.5 liter engine. And Rolls-Royce said, yes, we'll do that, and we think a 2-stage centrifugal supercharger is the way to go. And these are some of the components of the supercharger that Rolls-Royce built and developed and tested for the BRM. And this is the test rig that was set up at Rolls-Royce for the blower. It's mounted on the front of a Merlin supercharger in Rolls-Royce's test chamber. They did a tremendous amount of work on the components and development of the supercharger at the BRM, and they did it with great pleasure, they said, as a kind of after-hours activity that they really enjoyed. They had a lot of fun out of doing that. And the unique feature of the engine was the use of flame suppressors in the inlet manifolds. This is like aircraft engine practice, something that no other automobile engine has ever had. This was to absorb heat if there were any backfires from the engine. And SU initially produced an injection system for the engine, then they built a special carburetor. If you're familiar with the SUs, you know they're little sliding pots and so on. Well, this one had two because of the amount of fuel that it had to flow to supply the engine. The chassis frame was naturally made by Rubery Owen, who, that was their line of country. And we can see here the frame being set up at Rubery Owen's Midlands factory. The gearbox was patterned after the pre-war Mercedes-Benz 1.5 liter V8 transmission. One of the themes of this project was that Britain had won the war and was going to exploit the technologies that the Germans had developed before the war. And they had all the drawings and details of many aspects of the German racing cars. Cameron Earl went over to Germany to get all that material, and essentially the gearbox was more or less a tracing. My friend Harry Mundy did the work on it, and it was basically the gearbox of the 1939 Mercedes 1.5 liter car. The rear suspension was Mercedes as well, different axle. Here we're seeing it from the rear. And at the front, they used the trailing arm suspension of the auto unions. And